And I'm not even a historian. I'm history is not my thing. I forget dates all the time. I'm really, but with the Pohaku, so with this next novel, I think um, what I had always wanted to do with this book was something way more ambitious even than hula. And I actually wrote Pohaku way before I even thought about writing hula. I had this because I was living in California and I had moved from Hilo to Sacramento, and I was very homesick and culturally shocked. Like, even though I knew it was a different place, it was like, I thought, well, I look white, so I'll just, slide right in and it's going to be easy. And it was moving countries, it was so shocking. And I was so homesick. And my daughter was there and we didn't have anything. And growing up being raised by a tribe and then raising my children with a tribe, and suddenly I had taken myself and my daughter away from that. I was like, I don't know how to raise you without all your aunties and, and everybody. And we went on a trip with her school to Sutter's Fort. And we walked in, and one of the first rooms you walk in at Sutter's Fort, it has the two displays are blown up images of pages of his journals. And in both of the entries, he's declaring his just endless gratitude to his Hawaiians, his Kanakas, and saying, I couldn't have survived without them, and they did this and they did this, and I asked the guide, I was like, what? What do you like? Tell me more. There's Hawaiians here, like what? And he looks at me, and he was this native guy, and he kind of like he just shook his head. He goes, yeah. He goes, if not for those Hawaiians, none of this would have existed. Sutter wouldn't have gotten that land. He goes, but we don't know their names. This is all I know about them. And that's the only thing. So he goes, so if you ever want to write a story about them, let me know. Like, I'll be happy to read. And that stuck. And I, at that point, was not a writer. I was not trying to be a writer, but I had this idea of like, what if like somebody wrote a book about them? There must be more about them. So I spent the next 15 years kind of subconsciously looking and reading about Sutter and trying to find more about them, and talking about like the tattoos, what you were just talking about, like how people would take things or do things without realizing. So every year the national parks system in on the Big Island, which is our volcano national parks, one of the most visited national parks in the country, people steal the rocks, and we tell people don't. That the rocks are part of Pele. They have the energy of the islands. They're alive. They're part of this Aina. Not good, right? Don't take them. And so people do. And then it's not necessarily traditional mythology, but a lore has grown around this concept of like, Pele is not going to make things great for you if you take a rock. So every year you have letters, thousands of boxes with rocks, not a return to sender address on there, that say, I'm sorry, like we took this on our vacation and bad things happened. Please take it back. We didn't mean it. And I knew that. And so I started getting this idea of like this pohaku being displaced. So something that has a clear place in the world that belongs in one specific spot and gets taken. And somehow over the years, those two things mashed together of these 10 Hawaiians and this pohaku, but the structure was so ambitious, the scaffolding for it, and especially for somebody who had no writing chops whatsoever. And so I was trying to write it for years and years and years, trying to bring this story of these 10 Hawaiians to life, because I thought, if this is true, if there were these 10 Hawaiians and the only reason John Sutter got this land grant was because they basically vouched for him and kept him alive and helped kind of serve as his ambassadors so that natives or in the area didn't just immediately kill him, and the first structures of Sutter's Fort were Hawaiian and all of these things. I thought people need to know this, but years and years of trying to write this thing without really having the ambition for it, and being a single poor mom and all my spare time, so I'd be writing in the bathroom, or writing on note cards at soccer, and stuff, and failing and failing. But what happened was, because that story never kind of went away, it kept haunting me. I started trying to learn how to write. I started reading books on writing, learning about writing conferences, applying to fellowships, and talking to people and getting to the point of understanding my limits of my craft. But yeah, very ambitious. And so it was very intimidating because by the time I started, it's like when you don't know what you don't know, you think you're smart, And so by the time I realized, like when I started writing hula, I thought, oh, well, that's very difficult. I started looking back at Pohaku. I was like, what was I thinking? I'm never going to be able to write that book, recreate the gold rush, and very intimidating. But something about it didn't kind of let me go. And so all the history, to very long-winded answer to your question, all that history and to start back from the 1700s, I realized all of these things were so intertwined and connected. John Sutter and California and the history of Hawaiians leaving the islands to not to flee, but to learn things and bring it back. And there was such a value placed on experience and exposure to these places and things because they could navigate by the stars and they knew how to swim. They were on every hunting vessel. They were a part of the shipping, routes for a reason. And so they were in California and the Pacific Northwest, especially Washington and Oregon. They were there long before there's any record of them. And it's not until you start looking that you start seeing it. And so I was really kind of floored by it. And so when I start back in the 1700s, what I wanted to do was really employ that element of what we would call in the literary world magical realism, but in Hawaii, that's just reality, right? Of like, yeah, you have gods and goddesses and there's no questioning their existence, and you have things that happen that you can't explain through science or logic. And so starting there and having all of these historical elements that were all very true, I realized if I impose this magical one big pohaku that's been displaced, it glues them all together, and it really, in what I tried to do, at least by including all that history, was really honoring the legacy of what the pohaku represents to me, which is this symbiosis, this connection of, and this time where there was more balance to the world, like our relationship to it. There was more sustainable practice in harvesting and all of these things. And so by starting that far back, I could really explore, with the displacement of the Pohaku, I could really explore the divide between spirituality and religion and us and our environment and all of those things.
Would you introduce us to some of the present day characters that you inhabit here?
By present day, you mean what?
Well,
Since I go from
grandmother,
the
the
17.
daughter, yeah, that aren't in 17.
Yeah, I mean, so the story basically, to just give, anybody who's watched a very brief, the Pohaku is told by a grandmother to her granddaughter this story of their family legacy, and their family responsibility, which they are the descendants of this nursemaid who has been tasked with the care of this Pohaku. And through the years, these generations of women have to take it, and with the introduction of Christianity to the islands and to Queen Ka'ahumanu, there was a point in time where Queen Ka'ahumanu converted to Christianity and um, demanded that all heiau, which were places of prayer, and all idolatry were destroyed. And so I used that, and her nursemaid, instead of destroying the Pohaku, puts it in hiding until, in the hopes of this is just a temporary thing. But what we see, of course, is Christianity further dig its holes in, its claws into Hawaii and get a firmer grip on the culture and the society there. And so it gets taken with one of the descendants, one of the daughters, who represents, there were two women that accompanied 8 Hawaiians and John Sutter to California. And one of them was his mistress and served as kind of, there are varying reports and not a lot written, so I kind of had to fill in the blanks of how much influence she was able to kind of weigh on him. But she is in the book, the fictionalized version, the kind of the keeper of the Pohaku. And so she has this connection to the land. And so she advises Sutter where to put the fort, where to, how to work with the river and how it changes over the course of a year and its seasons and all of these things. And so she becomes kind of this trusted kind of advisor to him. And the Poaku plays a role into the gold rush, and her daughter gets kind of embroiled in this attempt to survive the chaos of the gold rush. The Pohaku gets stolen. And so from then on, those generations are tasked with keeping the story of it and the search of it for it to recover it and bring it back home alive. So the current people are this granddaughter, basically, who's in a coma. Mo'opuna just means granddaughter. It's slang in Hawaii. Like my mom will call, my kids her mo'o, which is actually a lizard, but your mo'opuna or your grandkids. And then tutu is grandma. So they're just known by tutu and mo'opuna. And Mo'opuna is in a coma that whole time, but part of what the grandma attributes to the reason why her daughter died young and her granddaughter has been afflicted by just a darkness and a heaviness and like all the things that currently weigh a lot of young people and older people down in Hawaii, not just poverty, but a lot of abuse, drugs, violence, a lot of things like that. And so part of what the grandma's attributing to the granddaughter's uncertain state is she doesn't know their story. And so there's this kind of urgency to tell her and fill her in on this with the concept of like we don't necessarily, it's hard to know who you are without knowing your history. My grandfather grew up in an orphanage and knew there were certain bloodlines that he had that he could never prove, that we didn't have paperwork for, and it haunted him till the day he died. And so I think that haunting kind of continues on. That's my legacy of like, who am I? And so that's kind of that overwhelming uh concept throughout the book of like, who are you? Are you anybody without your story? I wrote so many versions of this like through the years, and it changed so much. And by the time I was on the road with Hula, it wouldn't leave me alone, but I realized I had to scrap everything and completely start from scratch. And when I started writing when I started writing the tutu, I didn't really know where that was going to go or who she was. I more knew the what I wanted her to represent and what I wanted the Mo'opuna to represent. And so they were more of a tool. It wasn't until I really started kind of asking myself, why didn't she tell her daughter and her granddaughter this from the get-go? And really exploring like she's of that generation that really in Hawaii, there is like my mom's generation had, well, my mom kind of struggled with organized religion for a long time, in part because her parents were, one religion and then they converted to another religion and they converted her too. And it seemed so arbitrary and weird. But in Hawaii, there's a lot of religion. There's a lot of evangelical Christianity. There's a lot of Mormon, there's a lot of religion, but that lives side by side with what you would think is very contradictory, right? Which is paganism, where we go to the crater and we pray to Pele and we acknowledge her existence and everything else is alive. And so thinking about the tutu in this story, the grandmother in this story, a lot of people used religion, needed it to help them get over alcoholism and help them through endless suffering. But it demanded almost an abandoning of what you learned as a kid, or just abandoning of the acknowledgement of your surroundings, of Hawaii as this place that's still alive and speaks to you and does these things that don't often are kind of err on the side of unbelievable, and so her really kind of realizing that she was trying to protect herself and preserve her ability to be a Christian, which she needed to help her get away from her mother dying early and her alcoholism and her own kind of internal demons. And that was where it really started taking on a human element to me for her. It was really kind of looking at it from a very, far away lens of like, okay, she's telling the story, never mind the Pohaku, never mind that. Why did she keep it? Why was she willing to take the risk of letting that story die? you know, that disconnect. I know that I'm asking a lot for a reader to keep track of all of these people, and a lot of it, has a very different kind of voice or a very different tone or different pace for each one of these different generations of women, because but part of that was an attempt at least to try to reflect the times and the pace, like there during the gold rush and immediately afterwards it was chaos in California and everything. So I think Mahina definitely, I mean, so around that era, um, they really kind of, to me, um, there is a woman. So the only strain of descendant that I was able to really track, it's a woman named Mary Asbill, and she's buried up in Chico, and she was married to this man, this Hawaiian that she met at while she was advising for the Hawaiian exhibit at the Pan Pacific, basically San Francisco's World Fair, and but the only reason she was there was because she had been sent from Hawaii, but she grew up in Northern California and she's a descendant. And so I fictionalized some of it, but based off of her genealogy, I tried to I tried to stay as true to it as possible. And so this woman basically grows up there, gets swept up in the history of everything. She is living in Chico when King Kalakaua comes to California as part of his world tour. And at that time, they rounded up all the Hawaiians and everybody to come down to greet him, and this is true, and she chants her genealogy to him, and he immediately invites her to be a part of his court. So for the first time, she was born and raised in California, so for the first time she goes back to Hawaii with the king as part of his court and serves part of his court for a few years and learns about Hawaii and everything. And so I fictionalized a lot of that in the book, but the timeline I stayed true to, as much as possible, as much as I knew. And she decides to come back to California and go back to Chico, and she does all of these incredible things, and she was the only one. So Chico State University ironically had the most that I as far as archives and real research. So I went up there, and their special, archives department at Chico State, like dug up all this stuff for me, and some of it was her descendant, this man had, for a class, given them his oral history, and this class had written it down. So there were like scratched notepad pieces of paper in there, and he's talking about what the stories that he inherited. And it really reiterated that sense of like it has to be told from this grandmother, because what I want to implore isn't necessarily the story of the Pohaku, it's that the story needs to survive. I wouldn't have had anything about Mary Asbill or known any of this history about her and her relationship with the kingdom and going back and forth and traveling with the princess and doing all of these crazy things if not for the randomness of this one guy and this class in Chico deciding to interview him and them writing it down. And I kept thinking when I was trying to research them, I kept thinking there's a living room out there that where some grandkid is bored to death and has heard the story a million times of their great 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 whoever ancestor doing something with John Sutter, but I have no access to that. And the history that lives within our stories are, to me, the real history of who we are and where we come from. History books say so little.